So, with what's going on in the world, a lot of my friends have been getting into building computers. And one thing that they've mentioned a lot is that a lot of the build guides and things that they found online use a lot of terminology and just assume that people watching the videos already know at least a little bit about computers. Hey, what's up everybody? Dimitri of Caddac Gaming here, and I'm planning on making a video series that goes over and teaches you the different components of a computer. This video series is going to include a few videos that are going to teach you some things to look out for when building a new computer, what certain terminologies mean to kind of clear some of those questions up, recommendations when building a new computer. When I can afford to, I will be doing a build video as well. And then I'll be following that up with a what to do after you build your computer video, which I think a lot of people will find pretty helpful. If you have any comments or suggestions on videos that you would like to be part of this series, please let me know in the comment section below. So we're going to start off by going over the essential components of a computer, with today focusing on those main core components that are usually the most important when thinking about building a new computer or upgrading an old one. So the main elements of a computer are your CPU, your GPU, your RAM, your motherboard, your storage, your power supply, your case, your OS, and your peripherals. So let's go over the core components today, which is going to be your CPU, your GPU, your motherboard, and your RAM. So your CPU is the central processing unit. Think of it like the brain of your computer. What it does is it goes and processes all of the calculations that are needed for standard tasks, doing basically anything from running the OS to running programs. Now, there are two main manufacturers of CPUs in mainstream computers, Intel and AMD. Recently, however, Apple has been making their own CPUs based on an ARM architecture, which is a little bit more complicated, but if you guys would like me to go into a deeper dive on CPUs, their differences, and the different architectures, let me know in the comment section below and I'll go ahead and do that. So now, the main difference between Intel and AMD is what they've focused on in the past, and usually that's between clock speed and core count. So core count, a CPU is made up of multiple cores. You may have heard of a dual core CPU back in the day, or a quad core CPU. And what cores do is it allows the CPU to process multiple tasks at the same time. The more cores you have, the more tasks it can do at once, and the quicker it can do usually more productive tasks. Now, over time, gaming has started to utilize more and more cores as high core count CPUs become much more popular. Now, the second statistic of clock speed is extremely important because it determines how quickly your CPU can go through a certain set of instructions. Now, instructions are done on a clock by clock basis. So the faster that your CPU can complete a clock, the quicker it can get through a whole task. A whole task is usually made up of multiple clock instructions, basically. In the past, Intel has focused a lot more on having a higher clock speed and having an overall higher speed, and you would see these in gigahertz when looking at a spec sheet. Meanwhile, AMD has focused on having a higher core count because they kind of focused a little bit more on the value and the production side of the consumer market. Recently, however, AMD has been making some very big gains on their actual clock speeds, and they've been able to really tighten the gap, and in some cases, as of right now, they have actually passed Intel, not in the gigahertz on the spec sheet, however, but in the total efficiency of core count and clock speed, which allows their CPUs to perform better in a lot of tasks. Now, as I mentioned, core counts are very important for workstation loads. And there are two main types of CPUs. There are consumer-focused CPUs, and then there are workstation CPUs. Now, workstation CPUs are usually a lot larger in physical size than a consumer CPU. And because of that, they have their own motherboards that usually have a much different feature set, usually focusing on the amount of PCIe lanes or data lanes out of the CPU that other things can be connected to, like GPUs and capture cards and any other kind of card that uses the PCIe standard. In this video series, however, we're going to be focusing more on the consumer computer rather than the workstation computer, but if you would like me to do something on workstation computers, please, again, let me know in the comment section below. Now, the final part of a CPU isn't the CPU itself, but it's actually how you would cool the CPU. There are two main methods, using an air cooler or using a water cooler. Within water cooling, there are two different subtypes of that. There are all-in-ones or closed-loop liquid coolers. Those are the ones that you would buy from the store, that everything is already complete and it is a closed loop. So you have the pump, you have your tubes, you have your radiator, and it's all connected together. There's no maintenance, and you just install it and you're good to go. Open loop, however, are the very fancy, usually hardline tubing. A lot of people do softline tubing as well, but that is when you customize your water cooling loop for your system. These can get very expensive, but they are very efficient. They look great, and again, you're customizing it to exactly what your needs are, so it usually can perform to exactly how you would want it to do. So next up is the GPU, or the graphics processing unit, and this unit's specific purpose is to do all of the calculations and instructions for graphics or physics-based rendering. So many CPUs actually do have some type of GPU built into them, which is usually considered an integrated graphics solution, but they are limited to their form factor and, in the end, their performance. If you're going to be building a computer that is going to focus on gaming or going to focus on rendering, or utilizes a program that can do GPU accelerated tasks, in where the program will use your GPU's compute power to help accelerate the process, for example, rendering something or making very complex calculations like what Bitcoin miners do, then you would need to have your own dedicated GPU. Now, the GPU market is split between NVIDIA and AMD right now. Intel has talked about bringing out a new GPU, but that hasn't come out yet. And what NVIDIA and AMD do is they make the GPU die. They do usually sell their own version of the graphics card, but then they also sell those GPU dies to other manufacturers who then sell GPUs under their own name. So, you'll see an Asus GPU or you'll see a Gigabyte GPU, and what those do is they have the die and they get told by NVIDIA or AMD how to build out the PCB based on certain specs, and the AIBs, or the add-in board partners, will go ahead and make their own versions of the GPUs, and that's where you'll see a significant difference between certain brands' GPUs based on the specs that they focused on, the cooling performance, and the voltage that they allow. The higher voltage usually allowed to a GPU, the higher clocks it can get, but also the more heat that it'll generate. And that's very typical with computer components. So when you overclock, one of the things you usually change is an increase in voltage, and that will result in a higher temperature. So that's why you'll see a lot of overclocking focused items like beefier air coolers or liquid coolers. GPUs that are factory overclocked that have a much more over-the-top cooling solution built into them, or even a water block built in so that they can be integrated into a water cooling loop, and some of them even have a closed loop cooler built right into it, just like mine does. And that's why airflow is extremely important when thinking about a computer and building a computer, especially when you're doing one from scratch. So next up is your RAM, which is technically your computer's short-term memory. The computer will store bits of data on your RAM so that it can quickly recall that information without causing any kind of delay or lag or latency. Now, there are three main specs when it comes to RAM, and that would be the capacity, the speed, and the timings. Many motherboards will have 4 RAM slots, but some will only have 2. Typically, you want to populate your RAM slots in pairs, so 2 or 4 sticks. And what that does is it allows dual channel memory. The reason that dual channel memory is sought after is it allows more communication lanes between the RAM and the CPU so that it reduces the amount of latency and it technically increases the speed at which your CPU can access RAM. Now, RAM stands for Random Access Memory. And in terms of capacity, typically in a lower end computer, you can see capacity like 4 GB sticks, but in a lot of gaming computers, you'll see 8 GB sticks, 16 GB sticks, or 32 GB sticks, which are very expensive. And typically, you'll see someone putting around 16 GB of 2 8 GB sticks within a gaming computer at the low end. So the capacity just determines how much data your CPU can store on the RAM in order to access quickly. The more that it can throw on there, the more that it's able to quickly call, and it can do a lot more tasks much more quickly. However, unused RAM is wasted RAM. For example, if you're trying to upgrade your computer and you notice that you've never used more than, let's say, 12 GB of RAM with anything that you do, buying 32 GB might be a little bit of a waste, because any RAM that's unused, it doesn't help your performance whatsoever. You typically want to buy the capacity of RAM that fits your use case if you have a particular budget, but you can future-proof yourself by having an increased amount of RAM. The nice thing is, if you start off with 2 sticks, say 2 8 gig sticks for 16 GB of RAM, and then, a few years down the road, you're like, oh, I'm using up that whole 16 GB of RAM, you can go ahead and buy another 2 sticks, and now you're at 32 GB, and you should be good for the next, long while. So RAM speed is typically the most looked at spec, and you have to consider your CPU and motherboard when looking at RAM speeds. RAM speed works just like CPU speed, where the higher the speed, the quicker the RAM can complete a clock. However, certain CPUs and motherboards can only support up to a certain RAM speed, so you have to make sure that whatever RAM speed you're buying is compatible with your CPU and motherboard. So the timings can be looked at like latency. There are multiple parts of timing, and what those numbers all mean, it basically determines how many clocks it takes for the RAM to do a certain task. If you guys would like me to do a deeper dive video on what RAM timings mean, leave a comment in the section below. But if you'd like to go ahead and watch a video now, Gamers Nexus does a really good in-depth video on RAM timings, and then TechWiki from Linus Media Group, they do a good quick summary video on what RAM timings mean. I will link those up in the cards above and in the description below. And so together, the speed and the timings will determine the overall performance of your RAM, and people will typically lean more towards a faster RAM kit as long as the timings aren't too high, because when people overclock RAM, they usually play around with those timings. And lastly, the thing that brings all of it together is the motherboard. Now, think of your motherboard like the spinal cord or the nervous system of your computer. Almost everything that gets attached to your computer in some sort of way, your CPU, your GPU, your USBs, your storage, all of that gets attached to the motherboard. Now, depending on which platform you're on, Intel or AMD, you will have different sets of motherboards because the CPUs use different sockets. Within a socket generation, there are chipsets. Now, chipsets are what are on the motherboard that allow the CPU and the other components to interact with one another. And Intel typically releases a new chipset for every single CPU that comes out, and they are not cross-compatible. So a chipset from last generation CPUs will not work with this generation CPUs and vice versa. AMD, however, has used the AM4 socket, and they have allowed the chipset across that socket to work with each other, with a few exceptions, but majority of them work together. Now, with both Intel and AMD, they both have two sets of chipsets per generation. Typically there is a more budget chipset and then there is a more premium chipset. The budget chipset usually lacks a few features that the premium chipset does, but for most people those ones are pretty good, especially if you don't plan on doing too much overclocking. Although some of the budget ones do come out with a good overclocking board. Also, between the budget and the premium, you will usually see a difference in connections. So the I/O on the back of the motherboard will be limited on a budget compared to a premium one. The amount of M.2 slots might be different. One of the biggest ones for overclockers is the quality of the VRM. VRM is the voltage regulation module, and that's what helps deliver power to the CPU. The better the quality and the more stages the VRM has, the more overclockable the motherboard usually is to help with the CPU, and it can usually take on CPUs that require a little more juice, usually the ones that have higher clocks and higher core counts. Now, in my recommendations video and my tips video, we're going to go over the difference between features and gimmicks, because motherboards really do suffer from some of the heaviest gaming marketing, and it's really helpful to know what's a gimmick and what's a feature. But a good point of reference is that a $200 around US dollar motherboard is usually going to be the best balance of features for the price. It's not necessarily going to be the budget option, but it is going to be one of the best value proposition motherboards. On your motherboard, there are a lot of connections, and if you would like me to, I can do a video that kind of goes over the typical motherboard layout and kind of goes over what all the different pieces are for. But the typical terms you'll hear are PCIe. Those are the horizontal slots that you'll see in a motherboard, and those are used to connect external cards like a GPU, a capture card, a networking card, an M.2 adapter, lots of things. It gives direct access to the CPU. Things that go into PCIe slots are typically the highest bandwidth items that will be added onto your board other than your CPU and your RAM. So just remember, if you're not planning on overclocking anything, you don't need to spend, on one of those $400 or $500 motherboards. It just really doesn't make sense for you. Take a look at the budget options, and again, in my other video where we go over recommendations and how to plan out your build, I'll go over that in a little bit more detail. And that leads into one of my final points, is overclocking. So overclocking is the process of tinkering with voltages and speeds of your CPU, your GPU, your RAM, even a monitor. And what it allows you to do is it allows you to squeeze some more performance out of those components. Now, certain things overclock way better than others. Like, for example, Intel CPUs typically overclock much better than AMD's do, and it allows you to get some pretty insane speeds on them. Certain RAM modules will overclock better than others based on their like the company that makes the actual RAM modules on the kit. That's a little bit more complicated. If you guys want me to do a video on RAM overclocking, let me know. I don't do it all too often anymore, but I do it sometimes, and I do play around with the timings quite a bit. Typically, however, GPU overclocking will actually have the biggest performance gain on gaming, especially, and it's pretty simple. You can do it all without having to restart your computer, unlike CPU and RAM overclocking, and you do get a little bit more playroom. However, overclocking any of the components will typically shorten the lifespan by a little bit because you're pushing more voltage through those components. A lot of the times it's not anything super meaningful. You'll usually end up replacing the part due to performance, like its age. Then it will, die before you get to that point. But it is something to consider that you are typically shortening the lifespan of a component by overclocking it. And that's it for today's video. This is my first attempt at making a video like this where it's very informative. So if you have any comments or feedback, please feel free to leave them in the comment section below. I'd really appreciate it. If you have any suggestions for the next video, anything that you would like me to maybe focus on more or focus on less, please let me know. I am making these videos for you guys, so I really do appreciate and value your input on these. But if you did appreciate today's video, please consider giving me a thumbs up and liking this video, hitting that subscribe button, maybe hitting the bell icon so you can be notified of the next video that comes out for this series. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comment section below, or go ahead and join our Discord. We can talk about a whole bunch of things there. We can have a little bit more of a discussion. Love to see you there. And as always, I stream on Twitch from Friday until Tuesday. Come check me out, come say hello. If you have any questions, you can ask me there as well, and I'll try to answer them as quickly as I can. And with that, thanks again for watching. Thanks for making it to the end of this video. Stay safe out there, and I'll see you next Friday.